Good morning, everybody. This is Premed Chats with Dr. Nakae, and this morning we have Dr. Kelly Dore, who's the co-creator of the CASPer test from Altus Assessments. She's going to talk to us about CASPer and answer our questions about the exam. So thanks for being here, Dr. Dore.
Perfect. Thank you so much for inviting me, Dr. Nakae. I'm excited to do this and excited to be able to hear questions and answer any questions that people might have. And of course, I'm available afterwards too. If there's additional questions that come up through your session or after you post this, feel free to send those to me as well. So what I've tried to put together is a bit of a high-level overview of why CASPer and some tips and tricks that we sort of provide to everybody, but in a way that I'm really hoping addresses some concerns or questions that people, are of course going to have, because this is it's a very intense time as we apply, and I think this year, is no different, especially with COVID and everything going on top of that. So I hope everybody is well and healthy as we get started, and let me jump into things. So I'll start by just sort of saying that every year, the entire sort of applicant team at Altus puts on a webinar. So as of for the 2020-2021 application cycle, there's actually a full webinar available on the website with a ton of information if you want to go through that. It is a little bit longer than I'm going to go through today. And of course, it's all available on the website as well, that I'm going to cover. So if you want to go, you can do that. And there's always going to be an orange chat bubble available when you go onto our website, so you can always chat with one of the applicant support members as well if there's any additional questions that you have as we go through this. So I'm going to talk about why some programs are using CASPer, the logistics of the test and what to expect, a little bit on how it's rated, and how to prepare a little bit for it. So let me start a little bit why programs have chosen to use it. And I'm going to start with my own personal story of how I helped to create this tool. I was working at a medical school in Canada where I was a PhD researcher. So my background is cognitive psychology and health professions education. And through that work, I actually would get a chance to work and try and improve some of the things that we were doing in admissions. So one of my goals in trying to do that was actually to look at the personal statements that were submitted. So my mandate was to say, could we improve these personal statements that we were getting in terms of their reliability, in terms of were we actually able to tease apart applicants one from another, but were we actually able to get useful information out of them, because they're resource intensive for applicants and resource intensive for the programs. And so I did a lot of work trying to change the questions, trying to change the rating process to improve them. But the difficulty was, because applicants had 3 months to do them, maybe not surprisingly, at the end of the day, what we received was a very well-reviewed by everyone application. And what it didn't really tell us was much about the applicant themselves. There were so many pre-prepared responses that applicants felt they needed to use. And in all honesty, they tended to advantage in some cases people who had access to the system. So people who had friends or family members who were in the healthcare system who knew some of the lingo. And we didn't have a good way to evaluate them. So we know that we have good ways to measure cognitive or our academic abilities through GPA and MCAT, but our more traditional selection tools that we use to assess non-academic attributes really didn't have the rigor associated with them. So personal statements or essays, reference letters tended to be unreliable. So they didn't consistently measure people in the same way. They didn't predict for future performance and didn't always authentically represent who you are. I think a lot of times applicants feel that they need to use that reference letter to maybe show that they're looking at the school. So we found a lot of the buzzwords from our website were in the actual personal statement, but we didn't know if that actually reflected the applicant themselves. So we wanted to create a different way, a way for applicants to actually talk about themselves and find a way to really learn about their own personal, professional, or non-academic attributes well before interview. So we didn't want to wait and make our decisions based on primarily cognitive or unreliable tools. Sorry, my watch was talking to me as we chatted. And so that's where we ended up developing the CASPer test, and I'll walk through what it is. But the goal of it is to be a reliable measure that predicts future performance, that helps to better represent the type of person that you are. So to give you a chance to present yourself to all the medical schools that you're applying to in a way that authentically represents you. And so CASPer is a form of situational judgment test, or SJT. You may have heard about situational judgment tests before. They're a little bit different than the tell me why you want to come to medical school type of questions that you may see on personal statements or even have seen during interviews. The goal of an SJT is to actually present a scenario that is relevant to all the applicants and have them respond to that scenario. You may have heard of other SJTs, which are something called fixed response, where there's multiple options and you pick from those options and identify those that you think is the most appropriate or what you think you should do in that scenario. Ours is a little bit different, and let me tell you why we chose to make it that way. So first of all, it's primarily online. It's been online for a decade now. So we're lucky that during COVID, there's been no interruptions to the delivery of what we've been doing for CASPer. So we're very grateful that we had that flexibility of that tool from the very beginning, but we actually made it online for a reason. We wanted to avoid test centers, which we knew would add additional financial burden to applicants. And I come from a spot in Canada where some of our applicants come from up north, and up north is very rural and remote, and it's very difficult for those applicants to get to major cities to actually complete the examination. So we wanted to make it online so that it was accessible. We use everyday scenarios, so we don't use medical scenarios. You don't have to have any medical knowledge to write this test. And the reason we did that is we want to separate it fully from what's being measured on things like MCAT or maybe in your pre-med or science GPAs. We really wanted this to be relevant, and we didn't want to bias against applicants who maybe have had no exposure to the healthcare system up until this point. Our scenarios are also open-ended with no right or wrong answer. And why that's really important to me is that it allows us a chance to really talk about who we are and what we would do in that scenario. So Dr. Nakae and I may see the same scenario, and we may choose to do the same course of action, but for very different reasons. Or we might choose to do a different course of action. We might say we would do different things in that scenario, but both of our rationale is incredibly appropriate. And to me, that's such a fundamentally important aspect of the test because it allows people from different pathways with different experiences to still relate and talk about the scenario. It measures a variety of different constructs across CASPer. So the scenarios are multidimensional, but across all 12 scenarios that you see, you're going to be measured on things like collaboration, communications, motivation, problem solving, resiliency across the board. So let me tell you what the test looks like just so you're familiar when you go and write it. There's 12 unique sections. That means you're going to see 12 different scenarios. And those scenarios are very much rated onto themselves. So one scenario does not relate to the next scenario. They're independent from each other. Across the 12 scenarios, they're mostly video-based. And when you see that short video, we've now added a 30-second reflection period. And the 30-second reflection period is actually new this year, but we added it based on feedback from applicants who felt they needed a little bit of time after seeing the scenario before jumping in to answer the questions. So you have 30 seconds to think about how you might respond to that scenario. And then you have 5 minutes to answer 3 open-ended questions around what you would do and why you would do it, and some other questions related to that particular scenario. So over about the 60 to 90 minutes you take to complete the test, you do have the option to take a 10-minute break, but you're not obligated to take it. The one exciting thing about CASPer is that you get a full practice test for free. So when you sign up for an account, you get access to a practice test that you can take. This is just a screenshot from what the practice test looks like. But I thought it was helpful because it sort of oriented you to what this scenario is going to look like. In all of the scenarios, you're given a role. So you know what your framework should be when you actually watch the scenario. And then it will tell you how you're progressing along. And should you ever need help, whether it's just as you're setting up your account or as you're actually completing the test, click on this little chat bubble, and that's going to take you to our applicant support team. When you do the practice test, you get a chance to answer the questions in any order that you want, and you also will see what the framework is going to look like from the countdown timer at the top all the way through to the submit button at the end. We've done a lot of research on CASPer that I can dig into, absolutely. Some of the things that we know CASPer is not influenced by includes spelling, the reading level or the level at which you're typing. So we know that once your response hits a grade 7 reading level, so not a master's level English requirement, that your CASPer score doesn't change once you hit that grade 7. We know that repeat test takers don't have an advantage. Even seeing the scenarios in advance doesn't advantage people, although we do change the test content, as you will have noticed if you've done it before. We know that coaching often doesn't have the same effect that people want. We know that just simply taking the full practice test can level the playing field for all applicants. So I'll say it and say it again, is that we really encourage you to take the practice test and become comfortable with the format so that you're ready for your CASPer test day. We've also looked at demographic differences, and we know that for the CASPer test, there's smaller differences between demographic groups than for other standardized tests such as GPA or MCAT. And so while there are still some demographic differences that we're, as a test, trying to understand and work on or mitigate, we know that these test differences are much smaller than what we see for existing tests. So your CASPer test is actually rated by humans. It's not machine rated. And these raters, if you're writing a US test, are based from across the United States. They're a variety of different people. They're not all healthcare professionals. In fact, many of them are community members who have been trained and given implicit bias training to help select the appropriateness of the responses that they see. So all of your responses, though, when the rater sees them, are completely anonymized. They don't know anything about your name, which schools you're applying to, what undergrad degree you're coming from, or anything like that. During their certification, they actually need to complete a CASPer test as well, so they understand what you've gone through. And so that means they're not going to focus on things like spelling errors or English proficiency or incomplete or cut off responses. Instead, they're going to focus on the CASPer constructs that we're trying to measure in those scenarios, the actual content of your response, and they're actually rating your response relative to other applicants who wrote that same test. So they're marking a single scenario for multiple applicants. And what that also means for you is, because the rater's only seeing one scenario for you, is that if you feel you didn't do the best that you wanted to do on that particular scenario, just take a deep breath and move on to the next scenario, because it's a completely fresh start when you move on to the next one. So let me talk just very briefly about some of the logistics. Again, there's a lot more on our website about how to go through this, but programs are the ones who adopt CASPer, and they direct their applicants to take CASPer.com. Altus Assessments, that's the group that runs the CASPer test. We're in charge of verifying your account and your ID. So you do need a government issued ID when you sign up, scheduling all the tests. And I wanted to highlight here that we provide accommodations. So if you need accommodations for your test, if you can let us know about 3 weeks prior to your test date, we can make sure that those are provided, and obviously free of charge. But we just need to know in advance so that we can set up an appropriate test instance. For applicants, you reserve your test and pay for your test in order to get your score distributed to where you're applying to. You can take this test anywhere where you can get a webcam with a working microphone and reliable internet access. Just as a reminder, I would encourage you, though, to sign up for an earlier test. Don't wait for the last one, just in case there is difficulty with your internet or anything that you need. That gives you just an extra little bit of buffer of time on that. We have completed this from a variety of different places. So we've tried the internet access. I actually wrote it on a plane, on plane Wi-Fi. I don't recommend that for your CASPer test, but we just wanted to see from a bandwidth requirement what was feasible. When you go in and you say that these are the places that you're going to be sending your test to, there's a bit of logic worked into the system, and you actually find out what's the last possible date to deliver your to take your CASPer test based on the schools that you're sending it to. So the computer and the sign-up algorithm will work through that logic for you, and it'll show you all of the possible test dates you can take based on the schools that you've applied to. So I'm just going to briefly talk about how you can prepare, and I will go through this quickly, but the intent is not that it's fully explains everything. There is more information on the webinar or on our website, but I wanted to highlight some of the key questions that we get asked. So again, I'll say this again, there is a full practice test that you can take. So feel free to go and do that. You can do that as many times as you want, just to become familiar with the format of the test. there's also something called a systems requirement check. And that systems requirement check will help you make sure that your webcam is working properly, that your microphone is working properly, and that your internet is working just fine. So we suggest that you do that systems requirement check on the computer you're actually going to write CASPer on. And of course, there's tons of blogs and FAQs and things like that that can help you. And the goal is to minimize any test anxiety that you might have. And so we suggest that you reserve your test at least 3 days in advance and set yourself up on a computer. So try and be as worry-free as you can. We know anytime you write a test, it can be stressful, but our goal is to try and minimize any potential stresses. We've actually found restarting your computer on test day is very helpful, and don't hesitate to reach out to the live test support before, during, and after the test. That's what they're there for. Finally, try and find a quiet place to take the test. As you see, I get a few interruptions as it is, but just try as much as you possible. Let the people know around you that you're going to be taking this test, so you don't have, 5 roommates who are potentially downloading something at the same time. But try and run the systems requirement test at the same time of day you'll normally be writing the CASPer test, just to help you. Read all of your questions in advance. So as I said, there's 3 questions. So after your 30-second reflection period, those questions are going to appear. Take your time to think about your response, and then that'll help you make sure you're not repeating yourself and you just have a flow. You can answer those questions in any order that you want. So feel free to pick your order and do it in the way that makes the most sense to you. And one of the last things I'll say is use the full 5 minutes. I know most people feel that the 5 minutes isn't even enough, and we can talk about that as well. But our research has shown that people who do take the full 5 minutes tend to score higher than those who use, 3.5 or 4 minutes. So use the full time, spend your time reflecting. You don't have to edit your spelling and grammar, but just make sure you give yourself a chance to take a deep breath and think through what it is that you want to say. And if you don't finish that thought in the 5 minutes, don't panic. Our raters are used to this. And in fact, remember I said they took a CASPer test themselves, so they know what that's like. Just take a deep breath and refocus. Not finishing your statement or your sentence is a very common thing on the CASPer test, and they do make their evaluation based on what you've already said. So, and as we've noted, each section is rated by a different rater, so you have 12 opportunities to have that fresh start. So what I will say is there's some technical tips, including making sure you have both Chrome and Firefox uploaded. Those are the 2 browsers that we suggest you run CASPer on. If you've got them both ready to go, you can flip back and forth should you need to. Disable your VPNs and firewalls. And again, don't feel afraid to reach out to that live chat if you need to. That is what it's there for. So just a quick summary, and then I'll happily answer questions. Our goal is to make sure CASPer provides a more holistic picture of you to your programs when you're applying right up front. So they're not making any initial decisions only based on certain constructs like academic attributes. We want to increase accessibility, which is why this is online, and we have accommodation options available. We do always look at the reliability and evidence around CASPer, so we're happy to go into more detail about that. But again, should you want to use the chat bubble, or you can always email us at support@takecasper.com. So I'm going to stop there and thank you so much for your attention thus far, and see if I can answer any questions that you guys might have about CASPer.
I have a question.
Sure.
Okay, so it sounds like you thought the way you try to even out the playing field with just, making it accessible to all students, making it affordable, test-taking locations, it sounds very well thought out. What about your background personally drove you to that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Teresa. Thank you so much. So I always had an interest in professionalism and widening access at our medical school in particular. So in Canada, we talk about that from a socioeconomic perspective, including traditionally Indigenous applicants at our pool, other groups that have maybe been underrepresented within the medical school population. And so there's not much at my medical school I could do around our thresholds of GPA and things like that, we do have a bit of a different applicant pool, but that's my medical school there. So I think my experiences as I went through and worked with a lot of physicians and worked with a lot of trainees going through healthcare, I think I saw that there was an opportunity to create a group of physicians that I would want to be the ones that I was sending my kids to or my parents to. You know, we often, you know, there would be remarks made, you know, he's a great surgeon, you just don't want him talking to you or something like that. And it's like, well, why can't we have it all, since this is the group that's supposed to be serving our healthcare professionals? So it's not to say that we should ignore academic attributes in any way, shape, or form, but it's that we need a balance. And, you know, AAMCs, pre-professional roles, the ACGMEs, core constructs, and even in Canada, we've got our equivalent of the CanMeds. They all talk about things outside medical expert. But I think unless we actually put our stake in the ground and actually say that we're going to measure these other attributes, we aren't giving them the same weight. And that's my long spiel.
So there's a question in the chat. You mentioned that scores or performance does not change much from test to test. Does that mean that students who are applicants for medical school can use previous scores to apply for medical schools, or do they need to retake the test if they're reapplying?
That's a great question. Well, we know an individual score may not change much between writing it the year previous to writing it the next year. The test itself may change. So there's two components to that. One is that your score is based on relative to the entire applicant pool that's writing that year. So that pool may change. And so you want to be measured relative to the same applicant pool. And I would say also actually attributes of the test might change. So we want to make sure we're rating apples to apples and we're comparing the same thing. So for example, this year based on feedback, we added the reflection section, so the 30-second reflection section. So in fact, while we know test scores don't change time to time, adding that 30-second reflection period may benefit somebody. Or it may be that that's something that you really wanted to be part of your test. And I would say, you know, we make adjustments to our rater training every year. We try and improve it. We updated and lengthened our implicit bias training this particular year. So things like that, I would want to make sure, you know, we're trying to strive to have a better and better test each year that's reflective of the goals of what we're trying to do. So I would say that's part of the reason why we say the test it needs to be written every year. However, that is the reason we don't give people the opportunity to rewrite the test within the same year. We don't want people spending money rewriting a test for which we know their score won't change much within that application cycle. These are great questions, guys. Thank you.
I have a question.
Sure.
So since there's no right or wrong answers, what exactly do medical schools see once their report is given to them?
That's a great question. So Aisha, what they get is your CASPer Z-score. So what that is basically your mean CASPer score. So across all 12 sections, you get a mean score. And then we convert it into a Z-score so that we can compare all of the different CASPer tests that are written at different times of the year. So they get that Z-score, and then they also get your percentile, so your range of performance relative to all applicants. So that's the information that they get. So they don't see, you know, what you wrote on question 2, sub-bullet, or section 2, sub-question 3. The only additional information sometimes they get is in the very rare instance where our raters have identified a red flag or something egregious within the response. So that could be sexism or racism or something like that within the response. They will flag that. And then the school, if they get that, and again, that doesn't happen very often, they would get to see that response because they need to make a judgment as the school whether or not that is something that they want to consider. The other thing I will say that schools do sometimes get is because the test is proctored, as you know, if you signed up for it, you have to have your webcam on. If there's any indication that somebody is not the right person writing the test, we never stop a test. That's not our goal because we don't want to make that judgment, but we will provide the information to the school. So again, very rare instance that happens.
Kelly, can you talk about the studies that you've done that show that this predicts something very different than MCAT and GPA, just in the
Sure.
development of it?
Absolutely. So we've got some interesting data. I'll talk about our Canadian data first. Or actually, you know what, one thing I'll start with, Dr. Nakae, is I'll basically say we did start this test in Canada, but it's helpful to know that the US test is different. So our Canadian and our US tests, the content can vary, but also more importantly, our raters are different. So they're able to pay attention to some of the cultural constructs that are relevant population to population as we switch. But then we have started looking. So I've been working on this test in its development since 2005, which don't do the mental math calculation there about how old I am then. And we'll just keep talking. And so for the CASPer test, when we first started looking at it, we wanted to make sure if we were asking anybody to do this, that it actually had incremental value to the things that we were already doing. As I mentioned, I had a background trying to work through personal statements, trying to make them better. So we want to make sure this actually added value to both applicants and programs. And so some of the initial work that we did, we were able to look at outcomes longitudinally. The Canadian National Licensing Exam, so the equivalent of the USMLE, had a component that has the medical knowledge, domain knowledge that you would expect. It also has this other thing called the CLIO and PHILO. And that measures the cultural, communication, legal, ethical, organizational, population health aspects of people at the end of medical school and at the beginning of residency. And what's really cool is that the CLIO PHILO predicts for things like good peer review and lack of professionalism complaints. And so we were able to look and see that your CASPer score actually predicts later on into medical school and into residency your performance on the CLIO and PHILO, whereas things like GPA and MCAT predicted for your domain knowledge as you would expect. So it actually separated what we were measuring. We did another study with data out of US medical schools looking at what constructs are being measured. So construct is sort of like the overarching theme or the thing, so academic versus non-academic. And we looked at the old MCAT, the new MCAT, GPA, CASPer, and the MMI. And what we found is that when we looked at outcome scores and what was measured across each of the tests, the GPA and the more biological science, physical science, or sort of the academic focused aspects of the MCAT tended to cluster together. So they tended to measure similar things, whereas CASPer and the MMI tended to measure some similar things, although there were some differences. And then you had things like the CARS section, which sort of gave a little bit to the academic and gave a little bit to the non-academic. So what we were trying to do when we developed this test is to really get something that only focused on those non-academics, because we know that the academic metrics are already overweighted. And that's why we wanted to create something that was a little bit different. So now we have really interesting data coming out looking at performance for OSCEs. We have some data looking at match rates coming out. So there's a bunch of different things that are telling us this is providing incremental value above and beyond what we were traditionally measuring that will hopefully help us. And the hope is, again, that it's not just used in a way that says, you know, here's a cut and we're not taking anybody else. But if we bring in somebody with a lower CASPer score, we may need to support them from a personal professional qualities, characteristics. We may want to, when they go into clerkship, think about if they need support systems around communication. Like, I think there's a lot of opportunities there around as well. And I would hope the same thing would be true. If we bring in people with lower MCAT scores, we would do the same as we think about supporting them through their academic metrics. And we could do the same thing here, that this is an opportunity where we should be looking to support our students.
I just want to mention from a school perspective that another thing that I like about CASPer is that the scores are not released to the students, and although that is challenging, the students can get them from the schools if they want. But you're not going to ever see CASPer score averages on ranking systems or any kind of competition for that, because it's not meant to be a tool that ordinates students across anything. It's meant to be one tool that helps make sense of all the other components in the application. So the makers of the test are not giving us like guidance, or you shouldn't do this. I mean, they give you the data, and then schools incorporate it at whatever phase they want. So they can use it to think about who to select for interview. They could use it in final selection. They could have it in their back pocket if there's something discrepant. They could use it just to check for red flags. They could, I mean, there's several ways that schools could use this that fits into how to widen the selection process. And so I think for applicants, it's a little bit disconcerting to not get a score, but I think that decreases the odds that all this is going to be misused, as we see so many of the other standardized exams being misused. So
yeah.
Estefania has another question.
Okay, perfect. I just want to add to what you said, Dr. Nakae, and I feel very passionately that there is no silver bullet in the way we should do. There's not a single test that we should anchor onto, and that should be the only metric that we use. And I actually think some are currently maybe overweighted right now, but it's having enough additional data points to, understand a little bit more about our applicants from a program perspective, but also to make sure that the programs know who you are across, all the things that make you up. As an individual, which is just not your academic metrics alone. Sorry, you said that there was another question.
Yeah, so Estefania says, you mentioned differences in performance between demographic groups do exist, but smaller than other tests like MCAT. Can you talk more about those differences? If differences are smaller, how much smaller? How exactly do they compare to exams like the MCAT, especially in the US? And Dr. Dore, could you talk about how you guys changed the scenarios to like ways that you've closed that gap already in the development of the test?
Absolutely. So I'll start by saying that demographic differences do exist, and that's something that we're constantly looking at and measuring to try and make sure we've done enough, whether it's in terms of rater training, diversity of the actors in the scenarios, also just the scenarios itself that we're presenting, because there's a lot of construct irrelevant, I'll call them. So things that have absolutely nothing to do with the test that create bias. So you can have things that are construct relevant or construct irrelevant. So I'll use a really simple example. From a construct irrelevant example, one of the differences I could use is that all of our situations were in a very suburban country setting, etc., where somebody who grew up in a very urban area might not be able to relate to some of the things that we were talking about. And so for that reason, there would be irrelevant variance. We were measuring something that had absolutely nothing to do with the construct of empathy or communication or professionalism that we were trying to measure. And so the differences that do exist, because I'll maybe talk about that first, is that we see about, and it's about a third of the size of what you see in MCAT or GPA, differences with Black applicants versus white applicants, with white applicants scoring a little bit higher, very much smaller differences for Hispanic. We actually see the opposite. I wish I put the slide up for this, because it's a really nice data slide around those who are EO1 status tend to have almost negligible differences. Those from an LGBTQ, almost no differences. Females tend to overperform compared to male applicants. So it's similar how males tend to outperform on the MCAT and GPA. This is sort of the opposite effect of what we see. We don't see big age differences in CASPer. But one of the things that we're focusing on, and we do see some Indigenous differences as well. So some of the things that we're actively doing to try and change that is not only diversifying our rater pool. So we're actively trying to make sure that we're pulling in raters from very, very diverse populations. Right now, our rating pool who identifies as sort of non-white is only at about 35%, and we want that to be higher. So that's one thing that we're actively doing. Obviously in Canada, we're doing different things because we're engaging with our Indigenous population in Canada to actually see if we can reframe some of the social constructs around our CanMeds roles. And we'd be interested in doing something similar in the US, because we know sometimes things like professionalism is a socially constructed aspect. And so how can we make sure that we're actually measuring something that is relevant across the profession and not just something that's socially constructed. So there's a lot of work that we're trying to do to address those. So even though we have smaller differences, our goal is to say, how can we mitigate any construct irrelevant variances within the test? And that's a lofty goal, but it's something that we're trying to figure out and understand each year.
Another question from Estefania. If a student is a reapplicant and decides to retake the CASPer and use the new score to reapply, can applicants have previous scores or see how they performed on the old exams?
So as Dr. Nakae mentioned, we don't release scores. So there's not something that you could get from us in terms of your actual score. But you can, as she said, approach the school. We were doing a pilot this year to look at releasing quartile information. So for a couple of schools, we released quartile information after the test period just to get feedback on that. So it's something we're exploring about how we can provide information for applicants. But I think in all honesty, if try even just doing the practice test, writing down the answers and then reflecting on them, that's what I suggest. To everybody that I talk to is to take a chance and have a look through them. Make sure that you're taking big, deep breaths before it, and just sort of, again, do all of the tips and tricks that we suggest on there, because that's what the things that we have found to make a difference. You know, take the full 5 minutes, take your time through it, all of those things. And I will say, I don't know if, I think there is a blog article on test prep, but there's also a blog article that I wanted to mention around the demographic differences, so that's available there with the actual data on our website. So if that's something that you want to look at, because our goal around that is to be as transparent as we possibly can about it, so that we can make schools can make informed choices as well using that data. About the schools refusing to release scores, I've not heard of a school refusing to release scores. So I guess I don't know what the process would be in that situation. So you can always message applicant support for that, because I don't have an answer to that question.
You could try to let them know that if it's part of an educational record, because it's a test score, that you have the right to see it. I'd have to look at FERPA, the Federal Education Rights and Privacy Act, to find out if this is covered under it, because it's an exam score. But we can talk more about that too offline.
Yeah, I would be interested in knowing what the answer is to that too.
Yeah.
When you get that, just so I can answer that question. Okay.
Any more questions for Dr. Dore? All right, well, thank you so much for taking part of your holiday to chat with us and answer our questions, and we'll post this on my channel, so more students will be able to hear from you.
Perfect. And if there's any other questions I can answer, again, please feel free to reach out, or reach out to applicant support. Or if you have any other questions, you know, we'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye, everybody.